When the Ho first sent me that notice about my boat, I honestly thought it was a mistake. I've lived by the lake for years, and my boat wasn't just sitting there collecting dust. It was part of my life. Early mornings fishing, quiet evenings on the water, family weekends where laughter carried across the waves. But according to the Ho, it didn't fit the neighborhood standards, and they demanded I remove it immediately. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was just another one of their nitpicky rules. But then the fines started coming in, and the letters got more aggressive. The funny thing is, while they wanted my boat gone, the same Ho board members used the marina almost every single weekend. They held community events there, docked their own boats, and acted like they were the gatekeepers of the lake. That marina wasn't just a convenience, it was their pride and joy. And that's when I realized I had something they didn't expect. Because what the Ho seemed to forget was that the marina they relied on wasn't technically owned by them. It was mine. At first, I wasn't sure what to do. Do I keep fighting their endless paperwork and risk losing my boat? Or do I remind them, in a way they couldn't ignore, that power works both ways? The more I thought about it, the clearer the choice became. So when the next notice landed in my mailbox, I decided I wouldn't back down. I had a plan that would make every board member sit up and pay attention. Because if they wanted to push me out, they were about to learn what happens when you mess with the one person holding the keys to the only marina in town. Owning that marina wasn't something I ever bragged about. Honestly, most people in the neighborhood didn't even realize it was mine. It had been in my family for years, passed down from my dad who built it with his own hands. He always said the lake was meant to be shared, and that's why I kept it open to the community. Neighbors docked their boats there, kids learned how to fish off the pier, and families enjoyed the lake without worrying about access. I never charged a dime for it, and I never asked for recognition. But the Ho knew. They just assumed I would never use that fact to stand up against them. The board had always been tricky to deal with. They were the kind of people who smiled at you in public but slid notices under your door at night. They called it protecting property values, but in reality, it felt more like control. My boat was just the latest excuse. They'd targeted other neighbors before too, telling one guy his fence was the wrong color, another that his shed was an eyesore. Everyone complained, but most gave in because they didn't want the stress. I wasn't like that. Every time I looked at their letters, I thought about the weekends with my dad fixing the docks, or the countless mornings watching the sun rise from the boat. Those weren't just things. They were memories, roots, part of who I am. To let them take that away wasn't an option. Still, I had to be careful. I couldn't just slam the gates shut without thinking it through. The marina was more than wood and water, it was leverage. And if I was going to use it, I needed to do it in a way that the Ho wouldn't see coming. The tension between me and the Ho started to ripple through the neighborhood. Some of my neighbors quietly pulled me aside to say they supported me, but they didn't want to be caught in the middle. Others avoided eye contact, clearly nervous about what the board might do if they were seen siding with me. The funny part was, many of them relied on the marina more than the Ho ever admitted. Families with smaller boats couldn't afford private docks, so without my marina, they'd have no easy way onto the water. That fact gave me a kind of silent confidence, but it also made me realize the stakes were bigger than just me and my boat. Meanwhile, the Ho board was turning up the pressure. They sent out community emails talking about upholding standards and removing unapproved structures, though they never mentioned me by name. Everyone knew who they meant. It was their way of trying to turn the neighborhood against me, painting me as the problem, when all I wanted was to live in peace. Behind the scenes, I started digging through old records, just to be sure I was on solid ground. What I found made me more certain than ever. The marina had been deeded to my family long before the Ho even existed. They had no legal claim to it, no authority over it. Yet, they treated it like their trophy, holding events there as if they owned the place. That realization added fuel to the fire. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered what would happen if I really did lock it down. How would the board react when their own boats were stuck? What would the families say when they realized the Ho wasn't as powerful as it seemed? The idea lingered, tempting me, but I knew once I made that move, there'd be no turning back. As summer weekends rolled in, The pressure reached a breaking point. The whole board doubled down, sending me daily reminders that my boat had to be removed immediately. They threatened escalating fines and even hinted at legal action. It was clear they expected me to cave the way so many others had before. But every letter they sent only pushed me closer to my decision. The Marina wasn't just leverage anymore. It was the one card they couldn't control, and I was ready to play it. One Saturday morning, the neighborhood gathered at the Marina for a planned HOA lake appreciation event. I stood off to the side, watching as board members strutted around, shaking hands and acting like hosts of the property they didn't own. Their boats sat neatly docked, gleaming in the sun, ready for the day's activities. That sight sealed it for me. I realized they were flaunting what wasn't theirs, using the very place my family built to strengthen their grip on everyone else. Whispers had already started spreading. Neighbors asked me quietly if it was true that I owned the Marina. I never confirmed it outright, but I didn't deny it either. That mystery seemed to fuel even more tension. The board acted like nothing could touch them, but the unease in the crowd said otherwise. I went home that night and stared at the keys to the gate and the stack of old deeds on my desk. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. Once I moved forward, there would be no hiding, no pretending. The HOA had made this personal, and the next step would prove just how much control they really had, or how quickly it could all slip away. The night I sat staring at those keys, I thought I had the upper hand. But just as I was preparing to make my move, something unexpected happened that shifted everything. The HOA must have sensed I wasn't going to fold, because the very next day I received a letter unlike the others. This time, it wasn't about fines or neighborhood standards. It claimed the board was considering a proposal to take over the Marina for the sake of the community. They even suggested it would be better maintained under HOA management. My hands shook as I read it. They weren't just trying to get rid of my boat anymore. They were aiming to strip me of the one thing that gave me any real leverage. I knew it wasn't legal, but that didn't matter. If they could convince enough neighbors, if they could spin the story just right, they might build enough pressure to make it feel impossible for me to fight back. That's when I realized the battle wasn't only about my boat or even the Marina. It was about power, perception, and control. Adding to the tension, a couple of my closest neighbors came knocking that evening. They were nervous, voices low, saying they'd overheard the board talking about hosting a vote at the next meeting, one that could redefine community property lines. If that passed, even if it had no legal teeth, the damage would be done. People would start treating the Marina as if it really belonged to the HOA, and I'd be painted as the villain for standing in the way. That revelation left me shaken. Suddenly, it wasn't just me versus a stubborn board. It was me against a narrative they were creating. And if I didn't act fast, I could lose everything, even before I locked a single gate. The day of the HOA meeting finally came, and the tension in the room was thick. Board members sat at the front with confident smiles, papers neatly stacked as if they had everything under control. They opened with speeches about protecting property values and community improvements, slowly steering the conversation toward their plan to claim the Marina. Neighbors shifted in their seats, some nodding along, others clearly unsure. I waited, letting them lay out their case before I spoke. When it was my turn, I stood up and placed a folder of documents on the table. The room went quiet as I explained, calmly but firmly, that the Marina wasn't community property. It was privately owned, deeded to my family decades before the HOA even existed. I pulled out copies of the original records, complete with signatures and dates. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The board members' confident smiles started to fade. They hadn't expected me to have proof, let alone to present it so openly in front of everyone. Then I delivered the final blow. I announced that starting immediately, the Marina would be closed until further notice. The keys in my hand made a metallic clink as I set them on the table. The board's faces turned pale. Neighbors whispered frantically, realizing what that meant. Not only would the HOA lose its grip, but their own access to the lake was at risk because of the board's arrogance. Just when I thought I had turned the tables completely, one of the quieter neighbors stood up. She revealed she had been recording the entire meeting, catching the board's earlier statements about redefining property lines. With video evidence now in play, the HOA wasn't just embarrassed, they were exposed. The power they'd tried to wield so confidently had just unraveled in front of everyone. The recording changed everything. Within days, the whole board faced outrage from the very neighbors they had counted on to support them. People were angry that the board had tried to take something that didn't belong to them and twist the truth for their own agenda. The next community newsletter didn't come from the board. It came from a group of residents calling for new leadership. For the first time in a long while, the HOA wasn't in control. As for me, I decided not to keep the marina closed forever. After a few weeks of quiet, I reopened it with one clear rule. It would remain open to neighbors and families, just as my dad had intended, but the HOA had no authority over it. That decision earned me more support than I ever expected. People who had been silent before began thanking me, telling me how much the marina meant to them. The board's attempt to isolate me had backfired completely, and instead it reminded the community of the value of standing together. The boat that started all of this? It still sits on the water, tied up just the way I like it. Every time I see it, I think about the fight I didn't ask for, but had to take on anyway. It wasn't really about the boat, it was about not letting a handful of people control something they had no right to. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught me that sometimes the only way to deal with power-hungry groups is to remind them where their power actually ends. The whole learned that lesson the hard way, and I walked away knowing one simple truth. When you stand your ground, even against the odds, you can protect what truly matters.